Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to open this roundtable on militarization, surveillance, and violence in contemporary world politics. And I hope we will have a very engaging discussion. We will start with Katherine Hall. Katherine received her PhD in 2015 from the Department of Geography, Environment and Society at the University of Minnesota, where she wrote her dissertation on the history of drone technology, lethal surveillance, drones, and the geohistory of modern war. Before joining the School of Politics and International Relations at QMUL, she held a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship in the Society of Fellows in the Department of Geography at Dartmouth College. Katherine works in the field of international relations and security studies, political geography, and science and technology studies. And her research focuses on questions related to modern war and security, military and surveillance technologies, and the longer historical and racialized geographies of militarization and practice of state violence. So, you can start and then...
Awesome. Okay, great. Should I use the mic? Or...
We'll move the mic.
But then...
Okay.
I think it's hard to hold.
Can you hear me? Okay. Let me know if you can't. I'm not just talking to a microphone. So thank you all so much. It has really been a wonderful week, and I think we've had actually some really great conversations across the thematic courses around, sort of danced around some themes of militarization, security, especially in the context of my work, which is on drone warfare. And what I'd like to do today, and just some brief remarks to kind of set up some conversation and discussion, is to take part of this description that we got and to talk about militarization in the context of policing. And this connects into a project that I began working on that originally sort of came out of my interest in aerial violence more broadly, and so I want to talk a little bit about it in the context of the question of militarization. And what I want to do is to introduce this project to you, but then also to have to frame sort of 4 questions around how we think about militarization, surveillance, securitization. And one is sort of, and then this is probably going to be an ongoing question, is what do we mean by militarization and this concept of militarization, and what does looking at through the realm of policing do in this way? The second is thinking about the relationship between the military and the practices of the military and the practices of the police, and we got into a really nice discussion yesterday, I think, about this. And also sort of more generally, what do we think about the differences between war power and police power? And then thirdly, I think, and there's a recent security dialogue special, I believe it was security dialogue special issue on this, how do we think about work being done on securitization and work being done on militarization, and thinking these two together in a perhaps productive way. And similarly, in terms of the title here, thinking about militarization and links between militarization and surveillance studies as well. And then finally, or more broadly, I guess we could say, the brief story that I'm going to tell you raises some questions about how we think about historical continuity and historical difference, and especially thinking about histories of the present. And so I think starting from that point, when we think about the links between militarization and policing, we hear the phrase, right, the militarization of policing. And I don't know what this brings. It might bring some different imaginaries, especially thinking about what's been going on in Rio. which I've been learning about this week more. But in the US context, which is what I'm going to speak to primarily here, we think about the images of policing in, for example, in Ferguson, right? And thinking about the use of tanks and body armor and military technologies and sort of military tactics on the streets of Ferguson, on the streets of Baltimore. And we see this primarily as a kind of post 9/11 development, right? And part of this is there's a technology transfer program between the US military and police departments at the state and local level in the United States. The 1033 program, where police departments can either get for free or very cheaply military equipment, right? So this is a technological question around militarization and how that informs police practices. For example, one thing I found really surprising is that the University of Minnesota Police Department, this was a few years ago now, so the campus safety police essentially, had, I think, 3 anti-riot tank units or something, this like very heavily armored technology that they didn't allegedly use, and as soon as it came to light, they donated them. I don't know where, but they essentially had gotten this technology because it was sort of available. So we can see, in other words, militarization in this contemporary moment. And we see this too in the links to drone technology as drones are being incorporated into police departments. They're patrolled on the borders already. The Predator drones fly on the borders in the US, which have a very large territory that they cover. And they're often called into remote police departments like in North and South Dakota or in Montana to respond to certain events. Not easily yet, at least. So we can talk about this relationship between urban policing and militarization in this contemporary moment. But I want to tell you a story here, or at least talk a little bit about this research that I've been doing on an event that I think troubles some of this history. And one of the questions I want to pose to our group is if we talk about what is the use of talking about the militarization of policing. Shouldn't we think about policing as always already militarized, and that there's a long history here of this relationship, and perhaps we're looking at sort of two sides of the same form of power, and what is the utility in talking about this as a militarization issue, which is a term I've struggled with in this context. So very briefly, I've begun research on this. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this event. It's a 1985 confrontation between this group in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania called MOVE, which was an African-American group, largely a sort of semi-activist, semi-religious group in Philadelphia that had a long roots in the city. And then there's a lot of confrontation between the Philadelphia police, which is predominantly white, and historically fairly racist organization, and this group. And in 1985, on this one day, there's this large confrontation between the group that was held up in this row house in the city, and the police department. Essentially ended, and I'm totally giving you the brief version here, in the police firing 10,000 rounds of ammunition into the home where they knew that 5 children and 6 adults were sort of barricaded into this house. So they blew a bunch of bombs into the side of the house to insert tear gas into it using military-grade explosives, and then dropped a bomb out of a helicopter onto the house, and it burned down the house and 61 homes on the block, and it killed everybody but 1 child and 1 adult who were able to escape the house. And so this is a horrific event. And I originally got interested in it in the context of aerial violence. But as I dug more into it, you saw other forms of kind of militarized policing, the use of explosives, the sort of siege mentality, and this kind of overt display of force. And while there's a lot more to unpack about this, and I'm happy to talk about it more in our discussion, I think it raises some questions about the way that we think about the relationship between war and policing. And so in this case, for example, war very much haunted this event. A lot of the, not only in terms of the use of technology, but a lot of the imaginaries that the police officers described after the fact is they would say, while this was happening, as children were trying to escape from the burning house, they said, I thought back to my experience in Vietnam, and I thought they could be a trap, and they could be carrying a bomb, or they could be trying to lure me into some kind of, so they wouldn't go help the children trying to come out of the house. They would sort of keep this very defensive posture. And so I think that this raises some questions. This isn't obviously the only event we could trace in the long history of militarized policing in the United States. We could go back to the 1919 Chicago race riots, for example, and the use of state militias. We could talk about the formation of SWAT in Los Angeles against the primarily against the Black Panther groups. And I think, though, that what it does is it asks us to think about this sort of longer history of militarization that doesn't sort of have this shift with 9/11, right? And so this asks us really, what is the difference here when we talk about the militarization of urban policing? And I think, too, it points to, and I've given you sort of very little to unpack on this event, but it points to the question that I think doesn't come up as often in discussions about militarization and securitization, is the role that race plays and racialized violence plays in thinking about the links between the two. And so in the history of sort of militarized policing in the United States, it's against primarily Black bodies, right, and Black geographies within urban space. And so how do we scale this out in terms of our theories about militarization? And especially in terms of one thing we were talking about yesterday is the control of people in space and maintaining order and these kinds of linkages. And then finally, I think in terms of thinking about the relationship between securitization and militarization, which is still something I puzzle over because I see my own work as being kind of pretty fluid between the two. But what is sort of at stake here in mapping these two separate spheres out with one another? I think traditionally we studied processes of militarization and processes of securitization separately, but we can point, I think, over and over again to events where those are really difficult to kind of see as different. And I think there is some utility, but I'm going to leave it to the other panelists to describe what that is. Or our discussion, perhaps, to describe what that is, because it's something that I try to piece out of it and really struggle with as well. So I think I'll maybe end there. I don't know how much time that was, but I will pass it off to Claudia. Okay. So thank you.
So now I will pass the word to Claudia Aradau. She is Professor of International Politics in the Department of War Studies, King's College London. Her research has developed a critical political analysis of security practices. Among her publications are Politics of Catastrophe, Genealogies of the Unknown, and Critical Studies Methods, New Frameworks for Analysis, co-edited with Jef Huysmans, Andrew Neal, and Nadine Volkner. Her recent work examines security assemblages in the age of big data, with particular focus on the production of knowledge. She is currently co-writing a book on algorithmic reason and the new government of self and other with Tobias Blank. So,
thank you. Thank you very much, Marta. I am going to start by echoing some of the questions that Kate has already asked about the kind of usefulness of militarization, or how far we can stretch militarization and what it does for us. And I must start by saying that militarization is a concept that it's a confession, I have not used in my work, right? Be interesting to actually see if it appears. A few years back, at a workshop, we had a discussion about whether militarization or securitization were the right concept to use, right? Which one was more productive? I think that both are problematic, kind of looking back, and I did use securitization extensively, right? So it's kind of looking back and trying to think critically, but I'd like to also hear from you about the usefulness of militarization, because it's a concept that kind of leads to a lot of public attention, but also mobilization, right? So the kind of idea of militarization and the violence that it entails leads to lots of problematization, mobilization. I think for me, in similar ways, militarization, or I kind of stayed away from militarization, I think, to some extent, is that it suggests this exceptional shift, right, from something that was relatively peaceful or more peaceful or quite peaceful to a mode of governing, right, imbued by violence. And there's something exceptional about this process of militarization, which I think makes it in many ways similar to securitization. Now, unlike militarization, so surveillance seems to be much more everyday, mundane, normalized, dispersed. We often meet it with indifference, right? Or we often are not even aware about the modes of surveillance that we are subjected to. And I think this question of what militarization does is really interesting, particularly as the concept has been used quite extensively, I think, and it's come back again, as Kate mentioned, it's come back in international relations, but perhaps interestingly not as militarization, but as militarism. So that's another thing we could discuss. But for instance, the geographer Stephen Graham has used militarization to talk exactly about urban violence and urban governance, right? And has talked about ideas of new military, what he calls new military urbanism, which renders cities communal and private spaces, as well as their infrastructure, along with their civilian population, a source of targets and threats, right? So we can think about the relevance. I mean, that's something, the diagnosis of military urbanism, right? Or urban militarism, right? Kind of resonates a lot with the present moment, right? So we can see these forms of military urbanism. At the same time, Graham connects, right, what he calls military urbanism with both colonial and homeland wars, right? So there's a particular continuity, if you want, in his analysis of military urbanism. But he's less interested, he still places military urbanism in the particular context of the war on terror, right? So there's a particular moment where we see this kind of exceptional shift to, military urbanism. And therefore, all the practices of the Cold War, right, whether you think about preparedness against nuclear attack or the kind of broader, proxy wars, the kind of role of military practices in security and so on, is not primarily part of this exceptional turn. So how do we think about this shift? So it seems to me that very often, and particularly surveillance perhaps attunes us more to this, but also ideas around security technologies and so on. Very often we don't see this defining moments, declarations of the enemy, kind of moments of exception, right, militarization and so on, but you see much more dispersed, right, insidious practices that often we meet with indifference, right, that are so kind of dissipated that sometimes we don't, we don't even notice them, but also have some forms of continuity. So I want to actually propose, based on some recent work that I have conducted with colleague and friend, Martina Tazzioli, that actually there's 3 other concepts that we could use to attend not to this exceptional politics, but exactly to the everyday, mundane, dispersed, unexceptional politics of surveillance, of technologies, of insecurity and violence. And we've used in recent work the concept of circulation, extraction, and subtraction. Now, bear with me, right? Because it sounds like kind of quite 3, kind of quite abstract concepts. And I hope I make sense at least of one of the 3, right? I've given myself 3, I'll try one at least. I think circulation is interesting because, again, it alerts us, right, to this kind of everyday circuits that are both circuits of capital, circuits of commercialization, but also circuits through which, right, technologies kind of move around the world. And, circulation is a concept that is often used, but the way I've used it is actually in research that I conducted over the years in London in what are called security and counter-terror expos, right? You have arms fairs, you have all sorts of security fairs, but it's actually places where companies around the world, government, security professionals gather, to sell and buy technologies, right? And these are not necessarily, I haven't been to the, to the arm fairs, right? It's not necessarily the weapons trade, but there are these very kind of mundane technologies, right? Now very much, digital, but often technologies like fences, barriers, checkpoints, all sorts of urban technologies that are being, kind of sold, but also presented in these fairs as a kind of new way to deal with kind of new urban threats, modes of urban violence. And one thing that struck me kind of over the past 5 years or so when I've attended it was that in the wake of the London Olympics, right, and we can think about the Olympics here, I came across one of the companies that actually won the contract. It was called Zone Limited, that won the contract to build the fences for the London Olympics, right? And it was quite interesting to talk to them in the wake of the London Olympics because one of the things that they said was that, of course, they built the fences in order to actually prevent a terrorist attack. But then they also said that they worked closely with the Met Police in London to actually build the fences not just to stop, right, the kind of vehicle driving into a crowd that therefore, kind of building the fence, but actually to stop protesters from escalating the fence, right? So there were 2 things that were key to the design of the technology. On the one hand, that you could not escalate them, you couldn't hold on, they were so tightly built that you could not hold on to the fence, and they were so high, they were over 3 meters high, right? So they basically advertised this special type of fence that they built. Now, what was interesting for me in the wake of the London Olympics, that they came back to the security fair, and basically their key motto, their key message was, we've got, a big stock of these fences, right, that we are happy to sell, we are happy to loan, we have a lot of these fences. So that's what they went on doing, right? So the first thing, they kind of protected one of the NATO summits in Cardiff and London, but then interestingly, a few years later, the UK had a big debate with France about migrants stranded in Calais, right? And what to do about it. Now, the UK government said at the time, we'll give you fences at the price of a few millions. So the fences went to Calais, right? And what is interesting is to try to think about the work that these fences do when they travel. Now, the sale of fences did not stop there, right? The Zone Limited then sold fences to Oman to protect oil sites and so on. So you can start tracing, right, this particular production. But I think what's interesting is this circulation of fences around the world. So we can see kind of modes of violence that circulate with the technology, right, with what's inbuilt in this technology. And they circulate to very different sites, right? It could be urban sites, it could be, sites of labor. So I think it's interesting to trace this. Of course, this is a UK-based company, right, Zone Limited, but I think you can trace this circuits, these modes of circulation, I think, do not just go from London to Oman, right? You can you can trace kind of different modes of circulation and trace the dispersal, but also the violence that comes with this. What's also very interesting that in the kind of most recent expos in which the company was involved, this zone had bought a CCTV and video analytics company, right? So that the fences themselves had digital technology integrated, so they would process images all the time, right? So they would record and process images, and now kind of Zone became also a data analytics company. Right. So there's something really interesting that's going on in terms of these circulations and how physical technologies now kind of get connected to digital technologies and how fences become digital themselves, right, in the way of analytics. And all of this is circulated, right? And I think we need to be aware, and I think there's research to be done in terms of who's buying, who's selling, what kind of technologies are circulating around the world, but also what they do, because what we have here is basically a counter-terrorist technology, right? That's inbuilt. That's at the same time an anti-protest technology that circulates around the world with particular circumstances, particular consequences. Now, alongside circulation, I think it's important to think, and I think it comes from this example as well, to think about modes of extraction, right? That are also extractive operations that are not just about resources, and again kind of ideas of extraction and extractivism and neo-extractivism, right? Neo-extractivism has been used particularly in relation to Latin America, but I want to think of extractive operations, right? That turn, I take this from Martina and I take this from work by Sandro Mezzadra, Brett Nielsen, who talk about kind of modes of extraction and value production out of human cooperation and sociality, right? And think about how, these technologies, they can be technologies of surveillance, right? These technologies that I've been talking about actually use data, right? They kind of produce data, use and analyze data, and it can be data about, people who are around the fences, right? That could be kind of visual data and so on, and turn that into value. And we see at the same time the production, right, through the surveillance technologies of whole different kind of infrastructures that become data infrastructures, right, and produce value through the use of data, right? So we have kind of different modes of extraction. And finally, another concept that we have been working with, kind of trying to attend again to particular forms of violence that I think militarization is not really kind of allowing us to grasp, and again might be a very specific example for us, is subtraction. Now, subtraction is a kind of interesting concept, and we've taken it from actually an architect called Kella Easterling. And she's used the concept to try to think about kind of modes of modes of governing through non-governing, that's how I call it, modes of governing through non-governing, kind of deducting things, taking terrain. We use also taking terrain away, but modes of governing through non-governing that work through small details, work through ambiguities. And let me try to give you an example to try to indicate how we use subtraction. So again, what was interesting for us, going back to Calais, which is this place where migrants are basically have been stuck for a long time at this, border between the UK and France, was that more recently, after the eviction and destruction of a camp that migrants, had used for years, migrants were dispersed, right, through France, but many of them returned to Calais. And what happened is that they had many encounters with the police, but in these encounters, it wasn't these encounters are actually not based on registering the migrants or kind of trying to deport them and so on. But they are based on kind of modes of violence that do not create a relation and kind of govern them through some forced mobility. So migrants are pushed from one place to another, right, without being identified, without kind of being given any papers, without having any records, but they will just be pushed from one place to another, so that they don't settle in one place. And that there are all sorts of other means through which this is done, by refusing, for example, to give them any water, allow them access to water, allow the NGOs to actually give food or bring food, right? So all of this is kind of a mode of forced mobility, right, that kind of takes away any possibility for them to settle, to kind of be together in some way, to make any claim. So it's the impossibility, it subtracts, right, the claim to any modes of rights by not allowing a relation to be created, right? And this works like through ambiguities, works through small details, but also it works through these small violences where there isn't direct violence, but for example they would destroy shoes, or kind of allow the NGOs to bring food just within a very short time period, or create, for example, what they call mobile access to water, right? So you do not have water in one place, but have to move all the time, and therefore have no relation, be not able to make a claim to the state, right? So 3 types of kind of modes, I think, of violence, and 3 ways in which we can think about how violence is produced. But in a sense, I don't know whether it's I think that militarization doesn't quite capture, right? I mean, at the same time, I don't want to give up on militarization. So I don't know, I hope that some of you here will just kind of defend militarization and say it's really important that we use it, right? But it seems to me that it's exactly this kind of insidious, a lot of this technology, this move, there's forms of value production, of subtraction, right? That also kind of create modes of indifference. We don't quite see them, we don't see them coming together, and I think it's important to, to kind of understand these modes of dispersal and diffusion of these technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katherine and Claudia, for both presentations. Now we will have the presentation of Jef Huysmans. He is professor of international politics. After finishing his PhD at the University of Louvain, he took up a lectureship in international relations and European studies at the University of Kent. Later, he moved to the Open University, where he taught politics and international relations and was director of the Center for Citizenship, Identities and Governance. He joined Queen Mary University of London in January 2016. He is best known for his work on the politics of insecurity, the securitization of migration, and critical methods in security studies and IR. Currently, he is working on security and democracy in times of surveillance, the political life of methods, and the political significance of little nothings. He was co-editor-in-chief of the ISA journal, International Political Sociology, until 2016. So, Jef, do you prefer this?
Yeah. Yes, because otherwise it's not going to work. All right. Thank you. Yes, this works. Good. Put that here. Thanks, Marta. Thanks for inviting us all. The next roundtable. I'm not going to do fancy footwork here. I'm going to be like the French defense, very boring, old-fashioned, sitting back and trying to stop the ball from going into the goal. My question is really what I thought I didn't know what to bring around militarization. I've studied a lot around securitization, but one of the questions I thought is, how do we raise not just questions about the workings of militarization or of securitization of surveillance, but do a political analytics of it, get political purchase in the analysis, in understanding it. And so what I thought, and it's quite old-fashioned, kind of political analysis that's being done, is that one of the political questions that's continuously raised around whether it's militarization or surveillance or any security practice is an element in which security practice unbinds. It actually goes in areas where there are institutional, moral, practical limits where it normally we expect it to go. And so it's a mode of questioning and researching not just what security is doing, but how it is pushing boundaries that are set in place for not necessarily limiting it, but also organizing it, etc. And so several pieces in securitization, and specifically around surveillance or the use of policing around mobility, and I'll come a bit back around the military as well, all about that things are shifting. That was part of the research in the European Union, where you saw that one was policing mobility ever more. But this is not necessarily about immigrants. This was work that was done around football hooliganism and other elements where people moving around were stopped to move around. And this was done on the basis of blurring a distinction between criminal practice, deviancy and delinquency. And they have different status in criminal law, for example, among others, and how justice can be articulated in relation. And that's an element about how, somehow the security practices start moving and blurring distinctions and differentiations that are used to politicize in it. And so how that becomes actually normalized. So part of the underlying critique is that through hooliganism, some of the mechanisms used in, keeping the British hooligans away from the football field were then being used also, to deal with free movement internally and externally and so on. But the element is, and it's quite classical, this is work done by someone who works in law, is this blurring that you find in criminology, that is held on to between delinquency and crime. So that's in some way an unbinding of security practice where it starts moving and articulating and organizing itself in a way, that you can then criticize or evaluate what it's doing, and thereby it's changing in this case, the criminal system. I started calling this that security practices enact the limits or enact democratic limits. And the reason why I thought that was interesting for me, although I've been told now democracy is such an old-fashioned concept, we should not talk about it anymore. I've been told several times as a way. But there is an element about where democracy stands for various things. Yeah. And much of the critique, the political critique of surveillance and militarization does mobilize certain categories that are traditionally linked with what is democratic politics. Not as one, but several elements of it. And so the distinction between crime and deviancy is actually quite important within a criminal justice system. And criminal justice systems are actually traditionally seen as very central to democratic practice, that you actually deal them with due process and so on. So it's enacting, and I've got a bit of time, I'll speak a little bit about how security, militarization and so on can be dealt with in enacting democratic limits. And so I thought, and it's not a new practice about it. It has to do, for example, on militarization. We can go on, the normalization, the spread of the use of military technologies, and therefore it doesn't become so clear anymore whether we're doing classical military or, security surveillance or whatever. It's not necessarily anymore even a killing technology all the time, for example, etc. But there is something in democracy that has to do with the military. No, that when the military starts spreading, or military values, technologies and so on, start spreading in spheres that are considered civil, is a classical distinction. There is a problem of democratic politics. And I think it is an element in a way that you can see that when we look at militarization, whatever that means, whether it is an acting, somehow a blurring of the civil, or whether the civil-military distinction allows you to start seeing that it's entering and doing practices and taking over civil spheres. And there is nothing new about this, but it's quite central to security practices. And for example, I have a quote from Field Marshal Castelo Branco, from the 1970s, which indeed the military comes out of the barracks. But what they do is they redefine the practices of security. Security is not about defense. Yeah? Security, the concept of national security is much more complete. It includes global defense of institutions and takes into consideration psychosocial aspects, preservation of development, and internal political stability. In addition, the concept of security, much more explicit than that of defense, takes into account internal aggression manifested through infiltration, ideological subversion, and guerrilla movements. All of these forms of conflicts are much more likely to occur than foreign aggression. Now, this is clearly within a national bounded space, but it was a doctrine that justified the moving out of the barracks into the political sphere and the civil sphere and more, because society as a whole, psychosocial elements, bit of dissent, and I'll come back to it, economy. And it was not just the military who had this. And this, I'm talking now 60s, 70s, 50s. I'm not saying it's reproduced now, but it is quite interesting to see that lots of practices, even the global use of military technology to do and regulate all kinds of issues, whether it's movement, etc. There is an element where the military civilian distinction is blurred. And the question I'm raising is, because it's an old question, whether there is value in retaining this distinction to get an analysis about what's politically problematic about militarization, whatever it means. It could be just values and organizations entering in wider society, but it could also be the use of military technologies in all kinds of spheres to do security. And so that's one way in which you can see that security practices enact limits of democracy or democratic limits. But it does require that you read democracy not as it's an abstract concept, it's a general concept, but you take some key elements that are defining of certain traditions of what makes a democracy democratic. Because democracy is used in all kinds of ways. That's why many people have given up on it, right? Everybody claims democracy in some way. But you retain in this tradition some kind of distinctions that are quite central. And they're always negotiated, they're never clear. Right? The civil-military distinction is always negotiated, always fought, reformed, disputed, and so on. But you retain it, and you say there has to be a clear location of the one in the other. And so there is a negotiation on that element, and the question is, is there still value in retaining that distinction to do a critique or a reading of the politicality of military practice as not being just one of securing in response to something, but really about changing how politics is done and what the political sphere is. That's a difference, because you will claim technicality about you're solving a problem, but you're not solving a problem in solving the problem, but they're not solving. In enacting a problem, you're actually shifting something that traditionally is seen as a big stake for democratic practice. And that was one element in which I think it is worth bringing these concepts and notions back. Not necessarily in the old national security doctrine sense as it was done here and the coup d'etat, but also in the global spreading. I mean, the stuff that has been written about how we have, like in Jabri, the global matrix of war, where you have a blurring of policing and military use, but also the continuous, destruction of certain limits, certain distinctions that have been made, so that you can go targeting. You don't have to take sovereignty into account, for example, anymore. You just move across. So how do you do critical purchase on that? So that was one element I thought that is worth, and there are more. I mean, I don't have enough time. In surveillance studies you find that as well. Of course we have the classical liberties, freedoms, privacy elements, but there are also more fundamental different discussions going on around, for example, how the way surveillance operates currently, through in the security realm, but also more generally, is actually almost changing the possibilities for the subjects who are subjected to surveillance to make rights claims. That's a work by Evelyn Rupert, among others, which is that because it's so distant and so anonymous, the surveillance that happens, is that it's difficult to position yourself and be aware about what's going on, and therefore, the classical notion of the citizen who then stands up and says there is a problem and we enter the public sphere to rights claims becomes, it doesn't disappear, but it's reconfigured. And so to do that work, of course, you need a very classic notion of citizen, not a classic in the sense of belonging, but the rights claims notion of citizens, to see what's happening with that one. And so there's an element about that you cannot study security or militarization just as the processes of militarization. You will always need political concepts to do actually how is this process not only developing, but also doing something to how we understand what is political, where politics is possible, and how it is shifting what we can see democracy, how it's enacting the limits of democracy, therefore claiming democracy, and I'll come back and I'll conclude there, that democracy itself is not fit for security. That's also an element about enacting democratic limits. But it's a question where you bring political concepts to bear to understand what is actually happening, for trying to understand transformations in politics. Because the enacting of democratic limits is not only, and you can see that legal reasoning is the easiest to explain it, it's not just about limits democratic politics institutes onto the agencies and the technologies of security practice, or tries to institute. It's also that security practices sometimes enact, and that's an old element as well. I can go back to the same situation where I read Branko. Where one says that democracies are problematic for security, for development, and so on. So you first have to get, the military, and there are quotes from, what was it called again? I was an expert. The Trilateral Commission, by David Rockefeller. I'll read a quote. That's I believe it's 1973. The more democratic a system is indeed, the more likely it is to be endangered by intrinsic threats. Intrinsic challenges are in this sense more serious than extrinsic ones. We have come to recognize that there are potentially desirable limits to economic growth. There are also potentially desirable limits to the indefinite extension of political democracy. Democracy will have a longer life if it has a more balanced existence, and ultimately it's a justification in the end, partly also for military regimes that is underlying and running through this. Again, so that's 1973. Now, I don't have a quote here, I couldn't find it immediately, but go back, fast forward, and I'm not doing it exactly the same, but fast forward to 9/11, and the element that I don't know how many articles were written about that democracies are more vulnerable to terrorism. Therefore, we need to do something about this democracy thing. We have to hold on it, but we also have then to rebalance it in some way, which is of course a justification for the spread of certain security technologies. They could be militarizing, but they also are other technologies that come in. So somehow the old categories through which one thinks politics through the notion of democracy still give an insight in how you actually see political stakes at play in militarization, securitization, surveillance. And you can see these, and I don't want to give up these because I think to do political analysis partly also requires to hang on to these terms, and there can be different ones. I can draw to many different ones that are connect democracy. To actually therefore study security, securitizing and militarization always in connection to conceptions of politics, whether there are certain notions of citizenship, certain notions of democracy, certain notions of the separation of civil military, and so on. These are needed to actually make the analysis. An analysis about the politics of security and insecurity rather than the processes of securitization or militarization. I'll leave it there.